Hey everyone, how's it going? My name's Kelsey and I'm going to be knitting along to the Weasley sweater pattern by Alison Hansel. It's a really fantastic, well-written pattern. I think I made mine about 6 months into knitting. This is mine. I love it. It's my favourite knitted product. One of the best things about knitting the Weasley sweater is that it's a really forgiving pattern because it's so oversized and it's meant to have that handmade look. It doesn't matter if you make a mistake here or there. So I'm going to be constructing my sweater a little bit differently than how it's done in the pattern. So in the pattern you knit flat and then you seam the sides together. I'm going to be working in the round when I can because I find it quicker, it saves seaming. When you do work in the round though, you do forego having a seam down the side and giving up that structure that it provides, but because this is a baggy oversized sweater, I don't think you really need the seam. A lot of people, when I had a search on Ravelry, do decide to knit this in the round. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast on the stitches for the front panel and the back panel, work in the round until I get to the underarms. That's when I'll separate and I'll just work the front panel flat and then the upper back panel flat as well. When I get to the sleeves, I'm going to pick up all the stitches around the sleeve hole there and I'll join the round and work them flat as well. It's, yeah, again, a pretty popular choice from what I see on how to construct it. I think if there's a pattern where you want to convert it from working flat to in the round, this is definitely one where it's possible. If you decide to construct yours with in flat panels and seaming, that's fine as well. I'll be kind of talking through both anyway. So I added a 2x2 ribbing collar to mine. In the pattern, it's just a stockinette stitch, so it rolls down, which is the Weasley sweater look, but I wanted a kind of structured collar, so I went with this. I did 2x2 to match the cuffs as they're 2x2. I'm also going to be adding a bit of a hem because the bottom is just a stockinette stitch roll, just like the collar, and I want it to kind of sit flat. So if you're not doing that, that's fine, but I thought I'd just show you what mine looks like. You'll need your chosen yarn. I'm using this really beautiful City Tweed yarn from Knit Picks. This is in DK weight, so this is lighter than what the pattern calls for. The one I made is the heavier worsted version. I know this is going to fit because I've done a gauge, I've measured it all up, I know who it's for, and I've got no worries with this. So I've got a couple of those. You'll need your contrasting yarn that you're going to be using for the initial. You need your 5mm needles, or whatever the gauge matches, and a cable. I've got scissors, I have a darning needle or a tapestry needle, stitch marker, stitch holder for the neck. You can also use scrap yarn, so if you don't have one of these, don't stress. You'll need the pattern as well, so I've got a printed out copy. You can use digital, whatever you like, and I just go through and I circle what numbers correlate to the size that I'm knitting. So I'm knitting toddler, I'm knitting the smallest size today. So I've also got the measuring guide, the size guide in front of me so that I can work out where I have to split for the underarms. Because I am working front and back in the round until the armpit, I have to know when that is. So this is telling me that it's 7 inches in, so I have to knit 7 inches until I separate for the upper, front and back panel. The techniques you'll need to know in order to finish this sweater: you need to know how to cast on your stitches, knit, pell, knit 2 together, pell 2 together, slip, slip, knit, so they're the decreases. You'll need to know how to bind off your stitches when you get to that. You'll need, if you're doing flat panels, you'll need to know how to seam up the sides. Depending on how you want to put the initial on the front of the sweater, you can either use duplicate stitch where you have the sweater all done, you line up where you want the letter, get the contrasting yarn with a darning needle and then you go over the top, or you can knit it as you go using the intarsia method. I'm going to be using the duplicate stitch method so I can get the sweater all done and then worry about the letter later. Okay, so I think we're up to knitting it now, finally. Let's get on with it. Let's have a look at the pattern. So if I was working flat panels, I would be casting on the indicated number of stitches. I'm knitting the smaller size, so mine's 50. But because I'm working in the round, I'll be doing the back and the front at the same time. The front says on the pattern, work as for the back until the piece measures blah blah blah. So I'll be casting on 50 times 2, which is 100, just double your stitches. So I'm just forming a slip knot to pop onto my needles, and I'm casting on the 100 stitches, 50 for the back, 50 for the front, as I'm working in the round, using the long tail cast on technique. You're welcome to use any technique you like, I just prefer this one. My apologies for the darker colour, it's probably not the best colour to use when you're trying to observe through a video. Awesome, so that's 25 stitches, we're a quarter of the way there. I'm going to pop a stitch marker on so that I don't have to recount from the start all the time. I'm going to place one every 25 stitches just to make counting a little bit easier. Okay, I've got 100 stitches on my needle plus one extra one, and I'm transferring the end stitch to my left hand needle, placing my marker for the start of the round, and then I'm knitting the first 2 stitches together. It just really closes that gap when you're knitting in the round. You don't have to do this, but I think it's a fantastic technique. Now that I've knitted those 2 together, I have 100 stitches on my needles ready to go. So regardless of if you're working in the round or if you're working flat panels, now is the time to decide if you want a hem on the bottom of your sweater. I've decided I do. I've decided I want 1x1 ribbing, so I'm doing knit 1, purl 1. I was going to do 2x2 because that's what the cuffs are. I might do a bit of an odd match up, or I might do 1x1 when I get to the cuffs. I'm not sure, but I'm going to do 1x1 ribbing for the hem for about 1 inch. Again, this is up to you, it's your choice. You don't have to do a hem at all. If you want to work plain stitches, you can just do stockinette stitch. If you're going to do 2x2 ribbing, just make sure that the number of stitches you have on your needles is divisible by 4. If you need to alter how many you have to cast on, God, I'm not knitting very well right now, just add on some or minus some, and then once you've done the hemming you can fix that up by decreasing or increasing. If you're knitting in flat panels and you're doing a hem, maybe just write down somewhere, record how many rows you're doing, so when you get to the front panel you can have a quick glance of it and do the exact same amount of hemming. So I've just come up to a stitch marker I had to mark 25 stitches. I'm going to get rid of that one and another one that I have on there, but I'm going to keep my 50 stitch marker because it's going to divide the front panel from the back panel. I've knitted about 1 inch of 1x1 ribbing for the hem, and I got up to the white starting marker and I've just knitted a couple of plain stitches, so I'm just doing knit stitches to get that stockinette stitch effect. Now it's time to work out how much of this stockinette stitching we have to be doing. If you're working flat panels and you're just working the back, work to what it indicates in the pattern. If you're doing in the round and adding the letter later, work until the armpits. If you're adding the letter as you go, keep an eye where it says on the front panel you have to start adding that in. Mine would be 4.5 inches, but as I said, I'm adding my letter once the sweater's done, so I'm just knitting to the underarm. After working stockinette stitch in the round, this is what my garment looks like. I'm just going to grab my tape measure and I'm measuring from the cast on edge to where I've knit up to. For my size, I'm wanting about 7 inches, and then I know that I'm at the underarm, which, yeah, I'm about 7 inches. My garment so far, it's a bit aerated because, yeah, I'm using the 5mm needles with a thinner yarn. Yours should be a bit more dense than mine is. So I'm just still knitting this row, so I'm just going to knit to my starting marker, which is the white one. So if we have a quick look at the pattern, we will now be working the back section. So if you're working flat, just continue on to where it says there, but if you're working in the round, it's time to just isolate and do the back panel only. So in order to separate the front and back panels, You can use a piece of scrap yarn and a tapestry needle and just slide the stitches onto the scrap yarn, and you just go from the starting marker to the halfway marker. But I think, I'll show you how to do that now, but I think I'm going to use a stitch holder. So you just continue across the panel like that and pull the thread through. I just pop those stitches back on, and now I'm just going to feed them all onto my stitch holder. Right, so we've gotten to the stitch marker. We can get rid of that because that was just marking the front and the back panel. Rightio, so the front panel stitches are out the way. They're either on scrap yarn or a stitch holder, and we're free to work the back panel back and forth, knitting flat until we get to the desired length. So for the smallest size for me, I'll be knitting up to 13 inches. Again, this is from cast on edge, so I have to do 6 more inches. So here I am just knitting a wrong side row, so purling across, and then when I get to the end, I'm going to turn around and knit a right side row, knit stitches. If you've been knitting flat, this is all you've been doing. It's a bit tedious. So just measuring from the cast on edge to where I'm at currently knitting, and it's about 13 inches. It's a little bit shy, but mine's going to be a bit smaller, so I don't mind. So I'm happy where that is. If you didn't do a hem, yours is going to curl down the bottom, so just hold it straight. Don't stretch the fabric too much. So now it's time to work the shoulders. Under the shape shoulders section, the first step is to bind off 15 stitches for my sizing, and then knit to the end of the row. So you can see here I'm just binding off a stitch. So you're knitting 2, so knit 1, knit another one, and then pass the first stitch over the second. I'm going to do that for 15 stitches. This is what my 15 bound off stitches look like, and then knitting to the end of the row. The next row on the wrong side says to bind off 15 stitches and then purl to the end. So I'm going to bind mine off purl wise. So you'll purl one, purl another, and same thing as the right side, you just slip that stitch over the second one. So somehow I completely forgot to purl to the end of the row. I bound off the 15 and then popped the remaining 20 stitches straight onto a stitch holder, and then when I realised, I popped them back on my needle, purled to the end and popped them back on. So yeah, bind off your stitches, purl to the end, and then pop whatever it is indicated for your size, the middle stitches, onto a stitch holder or waste yarn, and it should look something like this. If you've knit flat panels, then it's time to mark the armhole with a stitch marker or some yarn, and you just pop it in. You measure how far down it says indicated. Mine would say 6 inches, and I'd pop that in there, but because I have splits in mine from working in the round, I don't really need to do that. It's now time to work the front panel. If you're knitting flat panels, then you'll just cast on as you did for the back, and if you worked a hem, you'll work a hem. If not, you'll just work stockinette stitch. If you worked in the round, we're going to just work flat, so we're slipping those stitches back onto our needle. I'm going to be joining the yarn and purling across and then knitting across on the right side until I get to shaping the neck opening, which for me is 10.5 inches. So I just worked back and forth, and this is about 10.5 inches. So we're under the shape neck opening on the pattern. So I have to knit 31 stitches, slip the last 12 onto a stitch holder, and then knit a further 19. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm knitting across the first 31 stitches on my needle, so that's 31 there. I'm going to grab my stitch holder and I'm placing the last 12 that I worked from my right hand needle onto the stitch holder. So it's from the right hand, not the left hand needle. So it's the center 12 that are on the stitch holder. The yarn will be coming off of a stitch on the stitch holder, so I'll be grabbing that and still working with that. So then I'm simply knitting across, for me, 19 stitches, trying to keep that tension consistent between the stitch holder and the needle, and then just knitting across to the end. I'm going to show you what that row looks like, because I think that's where people get a bit stuck sometimes. So I knit 31, put the previous 12 that I just knitted onto a stitch holder, and then knit the next 19 for my size. Now we're just working the right shoulder as worn, so just those stitches there. I'm going to be leaving the other stitches on the needle, but I'm not going to be touching them. So the next row is on a wrong side. We're purling to the last 3 stitches on the needle just before that neck opening, and then I'm going to be purling 2 together and then purling that final one. Then we've arrived at the stitch holder or the waste yarn, whatever you've got there. Like I said, ignore those other stitches on the needle. We're just working one side of the front shoulder. So now the instructions say knit 1, knit 2 together, and then knit to the end of the row. So once I've knitted to the end, I just have to purl across my next row. I don't have to repeat those 2 rows, but you may have to depending on what size you're knitting. And then I've just got to knit 1, knit 2 together, and then knit to the end of the row, and I should have 16 stitches left. So that's what I'm doing now. For my size, I have to then repeat those 2 rows. So once I finish this row, I've got to turn it around and purl across, and then turn it around again, knit 1, knit 2 together, and then knit to the end of the row, and I should have 15 stitches left. Once that step is complete, we just have to continue in stockinette stitch until whatever size yours indicates. Mine's 13 inches, so that should sound familiar because it's going to match the back panel. You can kind of see the sweater kind of form a nice shape now. You've got the front neck stitches on the stitch holder, the back neck stitches, and the shoulders slowly forming. Alrighty, so I've knit my 13 inches. I knit that flat panel, knits on the right side, purls on the wrong side, and it's time to bind off my remaining 15 stitches purl-wise. You can see how both the shoulder panels there, the front and the back, line up, and we'll be seaming them together. Now it's on to the next shoulder. So I cut that yarn from that other shoulder, and we're joining from the armpit and working in for this row. So for this row, we're knitting to the last 3 stitches just before the neck opening, and we're doing a slip slip knit, so decreasing 1 and then knitting 1. So this is going to mirror the other side of the neck shaping. So I'm doing the slip slip knit now, just knitting that final stitch, and then we're turning it around to work the wrong side, and we will be purling 1 stitch, purling 2 together, and then purling to the end of the row. For my size, I'm going to have 17 stitches left at this stage, and I do not have to repeat these 2 rows, but depending on your size you might have to. Then simply knit across the next row. On this next wrong side row, I have to purl 1, purl 2 together, purl to the end of the row. I then have to repeat those 2 rows one more time, so another plain knit row, and then another row of purl 1, purl 2 together, purl to the end of the row. That should leave me with 15 stitches once I finish this one. So now it's time to just knit flat until it measures the same as the other side, 13 inches for me. Cool, so now I've knit up to 13 inches from cast on, so it should match the other side. You can actually count the rows if you want to from when you start knitting even. I'm now binding off on the right side row because that's what we do for this left worn shoulder, and I'm just doing my knit stitches and passing them over one at a time until all those 15 stitches are completely bound off. So you can see that kind of matches up with that shoulder there on the other side. It is even, I just haven't stretched it out the same amount both sides. And now it's time to seam up those shoulders. I'm not great at seaming, so this is probably not an instructional video that you want to watch, but basically you go underneath a V, go back to the other side, underneath an upside down V, there as you can see, pull through, go through the next V, and you can see that it'll make your little knit stitches like a V between those 2 rows, and it'll be a bit of an invisible seam. And then when you get to the end of the row, you just tighten it up a bit, try and stay consistent with your tension. So I'll just finish that row. Yeah, when I knitted my Weasley sweater, I'm pretty sure I left these stitches live and then I did like a Kitchener stitch from there, but this is fine doing this invisible seam, it'll end up okay. So I'm just finishing these last stitches and then pulling the yarn through, and there we go. Repeat the invisible seam for the other shoulder, and then it should look like this. You can see how cute that looks now that it's all joined up. And it's time to do the sleeves. You could do the collar now if you wanted. In the pattern it says go to the sleeves, so we might do the sleeves, I think. It's time now to pick up stitches around the armhole to knit the sleeve. Very exciting. So the pattern says with the right side facing, pick up 48 stitches. So it's 48 stitches for my size anyway. So if you've knit flat, you should have a marker marking where the armhole is on both the front and the back panel. If you've knit in the round, you know where that is. You can make the armhole shorter and then sew it up there. But I'm keeping mine this size, and I'm grabbing a marker just to help out with counting stitches that I've picked up. So I'm folding it in half. I'm placing a marker, so I have to pick up 24 on one side and 24 on the other. So now that I've halved it, it's 12 per section. So it's just going to help pick up the correct amount of stitches without having to start over if you screw it up. We need to be picking up right side facing, because if we picked up with the pels, like this side here facing and going in this direction, we'd have an inside out sleeve and pels would be on the outside. So we're just about to start picking up stitches in the correct direction. So for picking up stitches, I'm just popping my knitting needle under 2 strands of a stitch. I'm going to grab my yarn and join that up. You can do a slip knot and pop that on your needle. I just loop it over. In order to pick up the correct amount of stitches, it's going to depend on your gauge, but you might have to pick up every 2 out of 3 stitches. So pick up a stitch, pick up the next, skip one, repeat, or say 3 out of 4. It's really going to depend on how many stitches you need to pick up and how many rows down your armhole is. So I'm picking up my 12 stitches until I get to the orange marker there. I'm going to place the orange marker on my needle just so I know if I don't pick up the right amount, I know where halfway is. So I'm picking up 12 stitches to the top of the armhole. I flipped it over. Now another way you can pick up stitches is with a crochet hook. You place the crochet hook where you'd put the needle through, and yeah, because it has the hook on the end, it just grabs the yarn a bit easier, and then you pop it onto your needle. I don't do it this way, but I thought I'd just show you guys what it looks like. I'm going to place my marker halfway down again. I removed it from the other side because I don't need it anymore, and I'm going to pick up these next stitches as I did on the side before. So I picked up my 24 stitches on that side, and all in all I have 48 stitches on my needle, and we're ready to knit the sleeve. You can knit the sleeve in the round or in a flat panel and then seam it up later. If you do in the round, you might not need the 2 stitches either side of the marker because you use them to seam and you won't need to seam up, but I'm just leaving my numbers as is. If you're purling and doing flat panels, you'll be purling and knitting back and forth and then seaming, but I'm going to place my marker and just knit in the round for ease. For my size, I just have to now knit 5 rows around and around, so that's just knit stitches for me. Just fast forwarding those 5 rows, and I've done 5 rounds. And I'm up to the standard decrease row, which is knit 1, knit 2 together, and then knit to 3 stitches before the end of the row, so 3 stitches before the marker. There's 3 stitches left before the marker. It's time to do our other decrease, our slip slip knit, and then knitting the last stitch, and we have completed a decrease row, and that's the decrease row we're going to repeat in order to shape this sleeve. So I'm going to show you how I keep track of my rows and where I'm up to. The pattern says repeat the decrease row every 4th row 10 times for my size, and I'll end up with 26 stitches once I've completed this. So what I do, I grab a piece of paper, and because I have to do 3 even rows and then a decrease because it's every 4th, I do 3 rows for even, so that's why I've got an equal sign there, and then I do a minus row for the decrease row. Now I have to do 10 of these, So I'll just mark 10 down the side. So now I've got a layout of how to track my rows. I have to knit an even row, so no decreases, so I'm just knitting around to the end of that row now. And then I'll go back to my little grid and I'll mark that off on my piece of paper to say that that's done. The other thing you can do to track your stitches is, because we're decreasing 2 stitches every row, I've already done that first decrease row. So I will have at the end of the next decrease row 44 stitches, then 42, then 40, and it just means that if you are knitting your first sweater and you want to keep an eye on your stitches to make sure you're doing the right thing, if you do stuff up, you can kind of narrow it down and pick it up sooner rather than later. Work through that 4-row repeat for how many times specified for your size. Alrighty, so I've worked through those 10 decrease rounds. I've just done that last one. I have 26 stitches left on my needle. I've worked left to right through that chart. And the next step says to knit until the sleeve is 9 inches for my size. So I'm at about 7.5 inches here. I need to do another 1.5 inches. No decreases, just working even, so just knitting around those. While I work these even rows, I am going to count them, just because I have to do another sleeve, and yes, I know I'll have to do 1.5 inches, but it's always better just to keep track of your rows. It's much easier when you get onto the second sleeve. So I've knit my 1.5 inches, which ended up being 9 rows, which matches my gauge. So I'm just going to double check that it's 9 inches for the sleeve here. And then it's time to work the cuff, and we've almost finished the sleeve. I've decided I want to do a 2x2 ribbing for the cuff, but because I'm knitting in the round, I do have to make an adjustment. I have 26 stitches on my needle. If I were to do the 2x2 ribbing, I'd have a kind of weird look with too many knit stitches together. If you're knitting flat, that's fine, because you need to use 2 stitches on the end to seam up and they'll disappear. But if you're knitting in the round and you want to do a 2x2 cuff, you have to make sure the number of stitches on your needle is divisible by 4. So I'm going to decrease 2 stitches in the next row to get me down to 24 stitches, and I'm good to go for the 2x2 ribbing. If you're doing 1x1, you're fine, as long as you've got an even number of stitches, or you can knit them how you want. The pattern says bind off in pattern. I was going to do a tubular bind off, so it looked a bit nicer, but I decided to just do the pass over kind of bind off, and you just knit or purl the next stitch on your needle depending on what it is. So knit the knits, purl the purls, and just go one at a time and pass the other stitch over. You need to do it loosely though, so you know they can pop their hand in the jumper. So you can use a larger needle size, so keep that in mind. That's a good little trick. And that's the sleeve done. So it's really starting to look like a jumper. Now we have to do the right as worn sleeve. So that's the next step. I didn't film it because it's the same process as the other sleeve, but this is me just picking up stitches and what direction I'm going in. That's the back, so I started at the bottom, around the back to around the front to just make sure the sleeve's going the right way. And here is the end product. Both sleeves are done. Now it's time to get on with the collar, which is very exciting. Under neck, the pattern says return back neck stitches to needle and join the new yarn at the right edge of the back of the neck as worn. So I'm turning my jumper over, that's the back of the jumper there, and I'm going to be sliding the stitches onto my needle. If you used waste yarn, it's just the same thing, popping them back onto your needle. Once they're on the needle, it's time to knit across those stitches. So you grab a new lot of yarn, join it at the back right side. If you pop your needle in the other way, you just slide it through so that you'll be knitting as per normal. And I have to knit across 20 stitches for my size, so I'm knitting across those 20, and then we're on to the next step. So now we have to pick up and knit stitches to the left side of the neck. So I have to pick up and knit 10 stitches. So I'm just doing the same method as I did around the sleeves to pick up those stitches, and once I've got 10 of them on, we're up to the front of the neck. So I try my best to space these out evenly. So now it's time to place the front of the neck stitches onto your needle in preparation to knit across them. So I'm just sliding my needle under those stitches while the stitch holder's on there. So I've got my needle through there, get rid of the stitch holder, and then just knit across those stitches. I've got 12, you might have more. Also, I just wanted to mention that I divide each section with a stitch marker just so when I recount, I can recount them in small sections rather than having to go all the way around. Once you've completed that, we just need to pick up and knit the stitches on the other side of the slanted collar. So I just need to pick up and knit 10 stitches. And we're ready to do the collar. I've now got my 52 stitches on my needle and I'm grabbing a marker to start working in the round. If you've been knitting flat, this is the first time you're knitting in the round, I think. So I'm going to do a 1 by 1 ribbing, just like the bottom of the hem that I did, but the pattern indicates just a normal stockinette stitch for 2 inches. So if you'd like just to knit around and around and around, that's what you do. I'm doing knit 1, purl 1 because I like that look. You can do a 2 by 2 ribbing, again make it your own, but I'm just going to go around for 2 inches. I'm just knitting this last row of 1 by 1 ribbing for my collar and then it's time to bind off. I'm just shy of 2 inches but I like where it's at the moment. What bind off method you use is totally up to you. I'm going to do a tubular bind off because I did a 1 by 1 ribbing and I really like that look and it's nice and stretchy. If you did a 2 by 2 ribbing or a stockinette stitch, you can do your basic standard passover bind off. This obviously has to go over someone's head, so you don't want too tight of a bind off. And yay, that's done. So that's it as far as knitting goes. We've got to weave in the ends, we've got to do the letter if you're popping a letter on the front, but yeah, that's the bulk of the work done right there, and here's the cute little sweater. I don't know what this baby's going to be named, so I don't know what letter I'll be actually putting on the sweater, but I'm just going to pop on a small T just to demonstrate the duplicate stitch. For the duplicate stitch method, I'm using a thicker yarn here, so I'm using the same City Tweed yarn from Knit Picks, but I'm using the Aran / heavy worsted version. I like how that looks because it doesn't leave any gaps, but you can experiment with different thicknesses of yarn and what you like to do. You can count stitches down and across, like as to where you want to put the letter, or you can measure, you can use stitch markers to place out where you want the letter. I think that's the good thing about duplicate stitch is that you can play around with it a bit more rather than when you're putting the letter on as you're going. Now I've just kind of eyeballed where I'm popping the letter because again I have to remove mine, so you guys put a bit more effort and planning into it if you wish. So getting onto the actual stitch method, I'm coming up in between a V there, so I'm pulling through my darning needle and we're intending to duplicate stitch the stitch above that. So we're skipping one and we're going underneath the 2 legs of a V. The stitch we're intending to duplicate stitch is that stitch there, but we're skipping that, going above, pulling the yarn through, and you can see we've formed one leg of the V over the top of the stitch, and then we're going back in the way we came up and we formed a V. You can see, especially with these contrasting colours, that it looks like a nice little V there. And we repeat. I typically only go in one direction with one piece of thread for duplicate stitch, so I'll use this just to go up, and then for the perpendicular, the top of the T, I'll use another thread of yarn just so that it's a little bit neater. The great thing about duplicate stitch as well is if you place a duplicate stitch and you're like, oh, I don't like the look of that, you can just reverse the motion and undo it really easily, and it doesn't do anything, if you're gentle, to the sweater underneath. So again, you can see I'm skipping this stitch, going up underneath the V and going back down where I've come from. So yeah, it's a really nice, easy method, I think. So I'm just going to speed up my duplicate stitch now, and I'll show you what it looks like in the form of a T, just a small one. I'm just repeating that same motion over again. I think one of the more difficult things with duplicate stitch is like picking where you want to put your letter and setting it out. It's kind of the pre-planning more so than the actual execution of the technique. To get a template of your letter, you can go on Excel and fill in and shade in the boxes that form your letter, and then you can print it off or have it on your tablet and you can just follow that layout. You can also Google the letter and write in duplicate stitch or intarsia or something like that. I got a template, I think, of my letter K when I made mine, and I just followed that step by step. I am going across the top of the T with the same thread, which I would maybe do in one direction, but like I said, I'd usually use a different piece of thread. When you're done, you just flip the sweater inside out and you weave in the ends for the yellow thread or the contrasting thread, just like you would any other ends of the sweater. And this is what it looks like when it's done. Now, duplicate stitch is fantastic when you're going in straight lines, and you can do angles with it as well, but I want to demonstrate another method you can use to pop the letter on your Weasley sweater. Now, this is called surface crocheting. I've got a crochet hook, I've got the contrasting yarn down below underneath the sweater. I'm going to get that caught in my hook and we're going to pull that up. So I've gone in between a V how I would with the duplicate stitch. Sorry, I cut a bar. Pull that contrasting yarn up and then pick where we want to go next. Now you just want to keep it even. If I'm doing, say, a V, we're going to angle it over. You can play around again with how many stitches you want to skip and what looks good. Go back down, catch that yellow thread. I really need a smaller crochet hook. Sorry, I just took that bar off. You've got 2 loops on the hook. You slip that first one over the second loop there. We're going back down, picking up that contrasting yarn and repeating the same thing. So we're passing the first loop stitch over the second, and you can see that's forming a bit of a chain. I actually think this looks neater than my duplicate stitch, and you can do this instead of duplicate stitch even if you're doing straight lines for sure. So there's 2 methods on how to put your initial on once the sweater's knitted up. We're almost at the end of the process. Now I'm up to the blocking stage. I haven't weaved in the ends of my yarn yet because I block and then weave them in. You can weave them in and leave the tail and don't cut them yet, just in case it changes, like blocking changes the pull of the yarn. So when it comes to blocking, the process you use in which to block your garment is going to depend on the fibre content of your yarn. A popular method of blocking wool yarn is to fill up a sink with cool water, a little bit of wool wash and submerging the garment for 10 to 15 minutes, grabbing it out, rolling it up in a towel, getting rid of the excess water and then laying it flat. I'm not going to be using that method. I think I have for this yarn before, but I'm grabbing a bottle of water. I'm going to spray it on the garment and dampen it. I'm going to be spraying the front, and I'll turn it over and spray the back. Usually you'd use blocking mats. I don't really have any, so I'm using a towel. I've gotten the yarn out from the tee so that it's not all lumpy under there. I've pinned it in certain areas where I just need it to hold. For some sweaters you'll have to pin it all the way down. Honestly, this yarn's pretty good. I don't usually need to use any pins at all. It kind of stays. And it's such a beautiful yarn anyway, it hardly requires blocking. Some yarns will require more blocking than others. So I'm pretty happy with how this is. I'm going to let that dry. And this is what it looks like when the ends are weaved in. I've taken the letter off because, yeah, I'm waiting for Bubs to be born, and I'll pop the letter on, and yeah, hopefully you've ended up with a nice Weasley sweater that you can enjoy and lounge around in. If you need any clarification or have any questions, feel free to ask, and hopefully I can help you out if possible. Alright, stay warm and take care.